Hello once again, and welcome back to our course. In this module we're going to be spending some more time on St. Augustine. In particular, we're going to be taking a look at his interpretation of the book of Genesis and the accounts of the creation and the fall that we find in Genesis 1 to 3. Now obviously these are some particularly important passages when it comes to the development of Christian thinking, and there are a lot of connections between some of the key ideas, the key things that Augustine focuses on in his theology and these passages. And so I thought it would be worthwhile for us to spend a little time looking at what Augustine has to say about how to interpret Genesis 1 to 3, because it will really reinforce and add some additional depth and detail to a lot of the things that we've been talking about with Augustine so far. His understanding of human nature, his understanding of sin and free will, his understanding of the consequences of original sin and the fall, the impact of all of these things on human beings, and in particular on our relationships, particularly in regards to sex and marriage. And so all of those main concepts that we've been looking at in Augustine's thought and work so far are really rooted in or draw on his understanding of Genesis 1 to 3. And it also, of course, has connections with his own personal story and conversion as well, that one of the key breakthroughs in his own growth into his faith was learning to properly understand and interpret Scripture. And his understanding and interpretation of Genesis 1 to 3 is a key part of that. So what I want to do then in this module is since really this is drawing on and reinforcing a lot of different things that we've looked at so far, I don't think we need the same amount of sort of me setting the scene for you before you dive into the work as we've done with some of the other topics and the other themes in Augustine's thought. So really I just want to kind of just very quickly and simply sort of set the stage for you to dive into some excerpts of Augustine's work on Genesis for yourself, and then you can really see and explore what it is that Augustine is doing there. So what I'm going to give you for the reading for this module is a series of excerpts from Augustine's literal commentary on Genesis. Now Augustine wrote, or attempted to write, a number of commentaries over the course of his life on the book of Genesis. And so he did a commentary, or attempted one, on Genesis very shortly after his conversion, when he was still really not adept at interpreting Scripture and really heavily influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy. And if you go and look at that unfinished commentary, you can see that there. But then the one that we're going to be looking at is one that comes from much later in his life, where he is very familiar and comfortable with interpreting Scripture. And you can see that in the work that we're going to look at, and you can also see evidence of a lot of the other things that he's been working on that we've talked about up to this point. So if you're interested in looking at Augustine's work on Genesis, there are a number of different works you can look at, and if you look at the title information on the book that I'm giving you this excerpt from, you can find that title, and that one title from New City Press actually contains a number of different commentaries by Augustine on the book of Genesis, so I would encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in going further. So we're going to be looking at this one literal commentary on the book of Genesis. Now why would he call it that, right? Well, one of the things just to know as you're heading into this is that there is a long tradition of commentary on Genesis, and in particular on the creation account and the account of the fall that we find in chapters 1 to 3. So Augustine is hardly the first author to do this in the early church. This was one of the favorite common themes for theologians, for those writing within the church to focus on. There's a whole genre called the hexaimeron, or the account of the 6 days of creation, and you can find one of those from any number of patristic authors. St. Basil did a famous account of the 6 days of creation. Ambrose, who Augustine is of course heavily influenced by, does an account of the 6 days of creation. And there are many figures who've done that. And again, if you'll recall from some of our previous modules, many of the church fathers are particularly influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy and this idea of this gradation of being that stretches from the one through kind of all kinds of spiritual beings or realities down into the physical world, and then ultimately down to prime matter. And you can see that at work in a lot of these commentaries, and Augustine is certainly influenced by that as well. But one of the things that you'll see in this last commentary by Augustine on Genesis is that there's still that influence there, but he is also, I think, become more rooted in a traditional biblical, even Hebraic understanding of creation and the physical world. In some of his earlier commentaries, you get this very Neoplatonic account of humanity really being our souls, an immaterial aspect of our being, and that the bodily component is added as a consequence of the fall, or is added kind of later and is a downward step. And you see that particularly in some of the Greek fathers who do an account of creation. But Augustine moves away from that. He moves towards seeing physical creation as God's plan from the beginning. This is how humanity was intended to be, and bodily existence per se is not a consequence of the fall, or is not some sort of degradation from a pure spiritual or immaterial state. And so when Augustine is writing his commentary, he knows this, right? This is in the back of his mind, and so he's very consciously taking a stance that is more positive in relation to the body than some of these other works that have gone before. Right, so now why is it that Augustine is doing this? And I think this is an interesting aspect to add to our understanding of Augustine so far. Remember, one of the things we've been emphasizing is that Augustine practices theology within the broader life of the church, right, and drawing on the life of the church and aiming to support the church through his work. And I think he is doing that here in this commentary. If we recall again, one of the challenges facing the church in Augustine's day is dealing with the Manichaeans, right? And the Manichaeans are dualists who see bodily existence as bad, as an evil hindrance to the ascent of the soul, or the freedom of the spiritual aspect of us from this bodily kind of captivity that we experience. And so, again, while Augustine is writing to his Catholic audience, many of them might be tempted by, many of them might have come out of this Manichaean view of things. And so really sort of doubling down, if you will, on the goodness of the body and material creation is going to be beneficial in Augustine's role as a pastor, right? So that where some of the Eastern fathers might be a little freer to speculate about whether or not there would be a purely immaterial existence for human beings at the beginning, they're not in the same situation. They're not facing this same crisis, this same challenge of Manichaean dualism. Right? Augustine does see this very real threat to the spiritual well-being of his people, and so he's going to distance himself from anything that's going to be sort of a Manichaean dualism, right? He's going to embrace the goodness of physical creation, right? So humanity doesn't get its body as a result of the fall in Augustine's mature thought and thinking about Genesis 1-3. He does deal quite a bit in his treatment of these chapters with the relationship between man and woman, between Adam and Eve, and also these ideas of marriage and sex that he's struggling with, both through, of course, his own experience, through his pastoral concerns, but also in his debate with the Pelagians, who have a different take on this, as you can see, and as we talked about before, in his discussions with Julian Maclana. And so that topic of the role of women, both in the church and in creation, and thinking about how sex and marriage was intended by God to be versus how we experience it, that's something that comes up quite a bit in his commentary here on Genesis. And so that's also something that I will make sure to include in the excerpts that you all take a look at. And again, here we find Augustine trying to strike that balance, right? He wants to not go so far as some of the more speculative Eastern fathers have, in terms of imagining that there could be procreation without any sort of bodily component to it that we might kind of I don't know, be these kind of glowing spheres that kind of reproduce by like amoebas do. We could just split apart and make more of ourselves. It's not entirely clear how this would have worked, but that is something that some earlier authors speculated upon, right? And Augustine is not going to go to that extent, right? He does think that sex and reproduction would have been different without sin and without the fall, but it would be bodily, right? The basic mechanisms of how humans reproduce were set up by God as good in the beginning. Now, of course, you can also see in Augustine his very strong emphasis on the effects of original sin, right, and the consequences of that, right? So he would say, yes, the way that we reproduce is the way that God intended it to be, but that has been distorted in a very significant way, and so that the passions and the lack of rational control that are part of human reproduction, he doesn't believe that would have been part of how procreation would have happened without the sin and without the fall. And you can read for yourself how Augustine conceives of, sorry, an unintentional pun there, how he thinks that reproduction would have happened without sin and the fall. But again, I think whether or not we agree with the direction he takes that, I think you can see what he's trying to do, right? That he is trying to balance his very real struggles with sin, the struggles that many people in his congregation would have been dealing with, while also affirming the essential goodness of bodily existence and bodily life. So we can see that at work in Augustine's treatment of Genesis. And then one final component that I just want you to keep in mind as you are looking through this commentary is to look at how Augustine works as an exegete, and in particular how he deals with these accounts of how creation happens, right? Because Augustine calls this a literal commentary on the book of Genesis. And so many of us might think that this would lead to an account or an understanding of Genesis that is like what we would call a literal reading of Genesis in our own time, right? So this would be more the perspective you would find in a more fundamentalist approach to interpreting Scripture, right? Where we would interpret Genesis 1 to 3 as a literal, historical, or scientific account of how creation happens, right? And so this would be Creationism, this is often referred to, or young earth creationism, right? The idea that the physical world as we know it was created in more or less 7 24-hour days, sort of in the sequence described in Genesis 1, and that human beings, Adam and Eve, are formed literally out of the dust of the ground, with Eve being formed from the rib of Adam. And so that's what we tend to think of in terms of a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis. And that is a topic that you will return to in the Old Testament course, and you can get into it in much more depth there. But what we're going to see in Augustine's account is, right, that that's not what he is meaning by this, right? What he means by literal account is, again, affirming that this is an actual account of a physical creation of human beings, that there is a historical component to this, that there were kind of these original parents of humanity, Adam and Eve, who did start off in a perfect relationship with God and then fall away from that. So to that extent, he's going to see it as literal, again, separating himself from the much more speculative, much more philosophical readings that some of the other fathers had offered, in particular the Eastern fathers. But he doesn't mean literal in the sense of young earth creationism, right? And what you will see when you look at his commentary is that he is very willing to regard details of the narrative, details of Genesis 1 and its account of creation, or the account of creation that we get in Genesis 2, or the account of the fall in chapter 3, right? The details in any of these he is willing to see as being symbolic, right? And so, for example, he'll talk about, well, what does it mean to fashion Eve from a rib, right? And that this doesn't necessarily mean literally removing a rib from Adam, but that there can be a more symbolic meaning to that. And he's willing to leave some of the details of creation and how that works up for human exploration, human study, the use of human reason, right? And this is one of the interesting aspects of Augustine's interpretation here. One of the ways that I first really came across Augustine's thought about Genesis wasn't originally in my work in studying the early church fathers, although I have no doubt there must have been references to it, but it never really stood out to me during the course of those studies. It was really when I began teaching and was teaching dealing with topics of faith and reason or religion and science, and that's when I came across this in dealing with the controversy around Galileo that happens in the church much later in history, right? 1200 some years later in history, when Galileo is having his big conflict with the church authorities. And one of the fascinating discoveries there is that in reading some of the letters of Galileo, where he's trying to explain how he sees his work as a scientist as compatible with his belief as a Catholic, is that Galileo points back to St. Augustine and points back to Augustine's commentary on Genesis as evidence for the fact that he is in fact interpreting Scripture in a Catholic way and in line with tradition. And so he will point to Augustine, who says that we need to understand that Scripture is intended to convey to us the truths that we need to know about our relationship with God, and that it is not necessarily intended as a science textbook, to the extent that there would be science textbooks in Augustine's day. Right, and Augustine is concerned about the fact that there are some Christians who use Genesis 1 and 3 and then who go around and argue about the origins of the natural world with the natural philosophers of his day, and that they don't really understand many of the things they're talking about, and therefore they make the Christian faith look foolish. And so Augustine very kind of strongly urges people to not do this, right? To not go around and talk about the natural world and its formation in sort of the scientific or philosophical terms of his day, but to instead recognize that Scripture, while it is true and while it's not contrary to a proper understanding of the natural world, that's not the focus of these passages, right? The passages are meant to focus on humanity's relationship with God and how sin affects that and how God ultimately overcomes that, right? That is the goal. And so we need to understand Scripture, Augustine argues, in a way that leaves open and it is compatible with using our reason to understand the natural world around us. And Galileo sees this as a perfect exemplar to follow, right? That this is precedent for his way of approaching study of the natural world, while also making sure that that study is compatible with proper understanding of Scripture. And so you can see in Augustine in the 400s, right, that this attitude that is kind of defines the Catholic approach to Scripture in our own day, of seeing faith and reason as compatible and seeing the focus of Scripture as being what is necessary for our salvation, and not seeing it as necessarily intended to give us detailed scientific or historical accounts of how creation happens. That's already there, present in St. Augustine in the year 400, which I think is fascinating. And of course, Galileo, I think, very much does prove his point, which was affirmed by St. John Paul II when he basically confirmed what Galileo wrote and argued that Galileo had, in fact, given us a good model for how to think about the relationship between science and our understanding of Scripture. And of course, ultimately, Galileo's account is rooted in St. Augustine. And so in addition to thinking about how his understanding of Genesis can give us a broader, deeper understanding of Augustine's thinking about sin and salvation and all of those things, and then how it relates to his teaching on sexuality and marriage, which has had a great deal of influence in history, looking at Augustine's treatment of Genesis 1 and 3 is also helpful, I think, in that it can show us how Catholics have understood Scripture, and in particular the book of Genesis, from the very beginning, and can give us some confidence that this is not sort of the church retreating or giving ground to science because we can't no longer maintain our traditional reading, which was very literal, In fact, that's not what has happened at all. We are not retreating in the face of the scientific revolution. That has been a traditional Catholic approach to thinking about Genesis and studying the natural world since Augustine's time. It really is kind of the old-time way of reading the Bible when you really get down to it. Anyways, those are some of the key themes and ideas that I think are maybe helpful to keep in mind as you go and take a look at this. As usual, I've given you some pretty extensive excerpts from Augustine's work here for you to look at. So I would ask for you to make sure that you read the introduction. The essay there, I think, is helpful in kind of reinforcing some of the things I've mentioned and also giving you some other context for approaching the work. And then once you get past the introduction, I would just encourage you to read around to the extent that you're able. So there are little subheadings for the different sections that I've given to you. Feel free to kind of flip through those and find the ones that you find most interesting and read as many as you're able to. And then hopefully when you all compare notes and discuss things on the discussion board, if you weren't able to get all of them, you might hear from another student who did read the passages that you weren't able to get to at this point. And we can come out of the discussion with a better understanding of Augustine on Genesis and a better understanding of Augustine more generally. So I look forward to hearing what you all think about these passages. Thanks.